This is a very, very exciting and important meeting for me. I feel that Oceana has arrived in Brazil at a time when the possibilities are beginning for a transformation of fishing in the country. Many of the questions that people have asked have focused on what advice do you have, what are the lessons you've learned, what should we do? And I have a couple of observations, two observations on that question. First, in the countries where Oceana has experience and where I have experience, which are particularly the United States, Chile, and the European Union, change does not happen until all of the sectors that are involved in fishing demand that it happens. It's not enough for the scientists to say, we're in trouble. It's not enough for the artisanal fishermen to say we're in trouble. It's not enough for the NGOs to say we're in trouble. It's not enough for the commercial fishermen to say we're in trouble. All sectors have to say that they're in trouble. They have to say it together, and they have to say that we want change. It's not sufficient to get the change that everybody wants. But the change will not happen and does not happen till you hear voices from all of the sectors that care about fishing. And that's the story in the United States. There are many, many years of good ideas and paper promises and plans that went nowhere until all the sectors came together and said, this needs to end. We heard the same thing was true in Australia. So these are not necessarily developed countries, developing country distinctions. Chile, the same. These are not necessarily distinctions between a kind of country and another kind of country. These are distinctions about how government works and what's the role of civil society in putting pressure on government. It's not easy, it takes a long time, but it's possible. And the second point is that my other experience from looking at different places around the world is no one from outside Brazil can tell you how to fix Brazil. We can give you ideas of what have worked in other places. We can give you examples. We can talk about possibilities. But the solutions to problems in Brazil must come from Brazilians. They must be a Brazilian solution to your particular situation. Many of the problems are similar around the world, but the policies, the regulations, the laws, the community adjustments, all of these things must come from you. And again, it's meetings like this that hopefully will begin that conversation about change, or continue the conversation. Obviously, it's been happening. So, okay, let's see if I can make this work. Yeah. So the question that I'm going to talk about, it's the question that's on everybody's mind when they talk about fishing, is how much is it okay to catch? Everybody would like to catch as much as we can, but if we catch too much, we know the populations will collapse, and then we will have no fish. So this fundamental question, how much is okay to catch, is at the heart of fisheries management. There's a nice complicated graph. This is an oversimplified version, believe it or not, about this thing that you've heard through the meeting called maximum sustainable yield. There's two pieces to this. Yield, there's three pieces. Yield, that's a fancy scientific way for saying killing fish. What's the maximum sustainable killing of fish that a population can sustain, a population can get without collapsing, without going down, down, down. Next piece is sustainable. That means we can continue it for a long time. That implies that there are unsustainable yields. There are yields that can drive the population down. So we don't want to do unsustainable yields. We want to do sustainable yields. But because we want to catch fish, we want the maximum sustainable yield. We don't want a small sustainable yield. We want the maximum. And you can have a small population, get a small yield, It may be sustainable, but there could be a lot more caught if the population were bigger. Or you could have a very big population, take a small amount, and there'll be a lot of fish always in the water. Finding that balance in between, MSY, this magic thing that fisheries scientists all over the world are looking for, that's what we're really talking about. How do we get the most fish or shellfish from the ocean without making the population collapse, and keep on doing it for a long time? So when we talk about fisheries management, one of the first things that people think about is, well, these fish are different. A shark is different from a sardine, is different from a cod. The shark, we can't take too many sharks from the ocean. The populations will collapse. So the sustainable yield from a shark is going to be relatively modest. Maybe the herrings and the sardines have a very fast reproduction rate, can come back very quickly. So maybe we can take some more, and maybe cod are somewhere in the middle. This is thinking about how much can we catch. But we can't ignore the fact that other factors affect fish populations. On the left-hand side, we have habitat. These are the fish houses. Baby fish need places to hide. If you destroy the houses of the fish, you reduce the ability of their populations to survive. In the middle, we see bycatch and the other two, we see bycatch and discards. These are the fish that we often don't count. We say, well, they're not landed, they're discarded, they're thrown over the side of the boat, so they don't count. But if you remember that maximum sustainable yield was really maximum sustainable killing, those fish are dead. They don't care that nobody lands them or that nobody eats them. So you have to think about bycatch and discards and try to reduce it. And even species like turtles that we don't eat or we mostly don't eat have a role in the ecosystem. And it's important to remember that every piece of the ecosystem may have an important role. You may not find out how important it is till it's gone. So driving a species to extinction is never a good idea. So if we're going to manage fisheries and we really don't know what's going on, we have to answer several questions. They're basically the questions a newspaper reporter has to answer. Who, what, where, when, how. So if you're going to do fisheries management, you're really not managing those species that I showed in the previous picture. You're managing people and their activities. Who are the fishermen? Who are allowed to fish? Do you have rules about who's allowed to fish, who's not allowed to fish? These are questions managers have to answer. What can you fish? Every country has fish that are legal to fish and can be legally sold in the markets. These are the what. What are the target species? What are the species you're trying to catch? They may include more information. This is a list of fish that say, in addition to being able to catch these fish, you have to have a minimum size for the fish. So what you can catch is a triggerfish that's over 12 inches long, for example. So what fish is specified is an important part of fisheries management. When can you fish? You may have closed seasons. Here you can see in gray open seasons, but you can see some white where it says closed seasons. There may be good biological reasons why you want to close a season. And there's one in yellow that says, well, depending on how the first season goes, maybe we'll have a second season. So who, what, when, where is very, very important. Where you fish and where you don't fish is an important method of management. These are just a nice picture off the east coast of the United States, an area that has been closed to protect deep sea coral habitat. We've talked about deep sea coral here. These are deep sea areas where no one is allowed to trawl on the bottom to protect the habitat. How we've talked a lot about. How is the gear that's used? It may be as broad as trawling, or it may be trawling with a 50 millimeter square mesh, defining the length of the mesh. All of these methods, fishing methods, these are typical examples from the Mediterranean. All of these methods are potentially the subject of fisheries management. You can do all of these things, when you're doing them, you're basically trying to see how close you can get to maximizing that yield, getting that maximum sustainable yield without going over. And obviously, these can be used in combination. This is an example of Australian seasonal closures where you're basically saying you can't catch this here during this time using the gears that are normally used to catch them. This is a typical way of managing fisheries by just focusing on, without actually saying how many you can catch. You can just do these kinds of management techniques. So the question is this enough? Is this enough to get you both to the yield that you want, the catch level that you want, and also to avoid the collapse? What if we're wrong? What if we actually are missing? What if we're doing all of these things that are hopefully trying to control fishing pressure, control the amount of fish that are being killed, but in fact, we've missed completely? What are the risks if we do that? The risks are high. The risks are species collapse. And all over the world, we have seen the result of generally well-managed fisheries using these techniques, but actually allowing more fish to be caught than could be caught sustainably. So I'm here to say quotas can help. This is a story of a fish called the striped bass that I know very well from my home state of Maryland. And if you look over on the left, you can see a very, very, very low number. This is the number of females that were around in 1982. The graph doesn't go back before that because they weren't collecting information. They were managing it by fishing gear, fishing mesh, seasons, no quotas, excuse me. Managing by all of these other tools, and they realized that they were one generation away from essentially exterminating the species from the ocean. And this is an extremely popular, important fish up and down the east coast of the United States. What they ended up doing is the states got together and they decided they were going to protect that spawning year class that was going to move through the fishery until it had a chance to spawn successfully. And these fish have the potential for living a long time, so they figured it would probably take several years. So one state, the state that was fishing on the baby fish, the juvenile fish, declared a moratorium. The other states did not. They kept fishing on the adults, but they reduced the pressure. And the rule was the moratorium would stay in place and the fishery would stay reduced until the population had a chance to successfully spawn at least one, actually several times in a row. And you can see what happened as a result. During that time of rebuilding, the states got together and they said, here are the rules that we're going to put in place when the population comes back and when we resume fishing, so we don't ever want this to happen again. And we're going to set the limits. We're going to actually set quotas on how many fish we're able to catch each year to make sure that the population keeps on growing. So I've said quotas about 10 times so far. What the hell is a quota? A quota is simply the amount of fish, and for some reason fish are always measured by weight, pounds or kilograms, rather than numbers of fish, but by weight that fishermen are allowed to catch over some period of time, and usually we talk about a year. It could be a season, it could be a day, it could be anything. But you'll also hear people talk about annual quotas or total allowable catches or TACs or annual catch limits or ACLs. These are all basically ways that fishery scientists use to confuse people. No, it's not deliberate, but it's an outcome. They use these terms to define how much killing you can do of a fish from a fish population to give you the amount of fish that you want. What should a quota be?
looks like the same graph, but it's a little bit different. One of the things that we know is how we've heard a lot about what do you do when the data is bad? What do you do when you don't have good data? The answer is you have to be a little bit careful. Even if you think you know perfectly what the level of fishing is that will drive the population down, and you want to stay above that, in fact, you've kind of got a 50-50 chance, an equal chance, that that will happen if you use that as the target. You might go over, you might go under, you might have made an estimate error one way or the other. So this is the system that's used in the US, which basically says, let's reduce the chance of test. Let's reduce the chance of overfishing. Let's reduce the chance of fishing too much, maybe down to 40% where the letters A, B, C show up, or actually at the level that people choose, which is 30%, and that's where in the US the rules established in some councils as the level that is set for the catch. That's your target. Notice that even at that level, there's still some chance that you might be overfishing, that you might be fishing too high. And what that means is you have to pay attention. You can't just set something in place and let it go for 10 years. So paying attention to the quotas is important. This is an example of a system that did not work with quotas. This is the Chilean jack mackerel, once a very, very important fishery in Chile. Why didn't it work? It didn't work because basically the scientists recommended catches that were in green, and the government allowed catches that were in red. And if you look at the difference, it didn't start off too bad, but remember this graph, the population's going up, then it's going down. And year after year, when you allow too much fishing, more than the scientific recommendations, you suddenly end up with collapse, and it can be very quick that the population can collapse. So by 2011, finally, the truth came out about what was happening in Chile, and the quotas were reduced. And now the Chilean system has actually been overhauled so that the government has to follow the recommendations of the scientists. The government no longer is allowed to say, well, scientists don't really know, so maybe 20% more is okay. European Union, very civilized, very developed country, has a similar situation. If you look at the blue dotted lines, if you look to the lower left, you'll see that 2 out of 35 fish stocks in the Northeast Atlantic were fished at MSY, were fished at levels that were not designed, were not sure to come up with overfishing. Gradually over time, the European Union has started managing its fish more sensibly, establishing quotas that are actually in line with the scientific recommendations, and as a result, we're seeing the change in the green line, which is the decline of overfished populations. What does that mean? What's the result of that? The result of that, take a look at the green line. That's the important one. The 2 lines below and the total line are heavily influenced by herring and capelin, which fluctuate a lot. But the green line shows that we've seen about a 20% increase in the biomass, in the amount of fish in the Northeast Atlantic since the the European Union has started managing its fish sensibly. And most of that increase has really come in the last 10 years or so. So you've seen a significant increase. If you look at particular fisheries, you can see 2 other things. In addition to the increase in the biomass, which is another way of saying population, the biomass of cod, the catches are starting to come up. The fisheries managers now feel safe enough about the recovery of the cod population that they're allowing, the scientists are recommending increases in catches. Similarly with hake, and even beginning with mackerel. So lessons learned from this. First, this is a picture of our red snapper in the United States. And one of the things that you can see is a long period of very, very low abundance. It's not because nobody didn't know. It's not because we wondered what was going on. We knew exactly what was going on. And the answer was, finally, in 2006, everyone got together and said, we have to change the fisheries management to a new system that could be called, this time we mean it. You have to end overfishing. You have to fish sustainably. And since that time, the population's increased. One obvious lesson is quotas do not cure all problems. They are not a panacea. They cannot be, you would like to think that they could substitute for all of these other measures, but they can't always. You may have simply too many boats, and subsidies may be a big factor that need to be addressed, or you may simply need to do spatial management, temporal management, and obviously people management along with it. So this isn't a substitute for everything else. It is important to try to set quotas for as many species as possible. Start with the most important ones, but don't pretend that you don't have these other fish being caught, because if they end up getting caught, then you end up with red lists. So setting quotas and planning to rebuild your fish populations and keeping an eye on as many as possible. And there are big multi-species fisheries in Europe and the United States. These are not impossible solutions technically. Set your limits carefully. It's really, as I said, it's really important to make sure that you don't set the highest level possible as a target, because the only way you're going to find out that you missed the target is when you go over it, and then your population is in trouble. So be careful. The less you know, the more careful you should be. Accountability, this is a little bit different from enforcement. Accountability means, all right, so what happens if everybody's followed the rules and done what the managers have said? What happens if you go over? What happens if you go over your quota in a year? In the United States, the federal government prescribes sort of a menu of things that you can do to try to make sure that, although it's nobody's fault, you still have to make sure the population doesn't crash. And our equivalent of the CPG, the Fisheries Management Councils, are responsible for sitting around the table, discussing and deciding which of these choices from the menu they're going to pick for accountability. But you have to have something. It may be you close the season. If you have really good information, it may be just time to close the season. If you don't have really good information because it takes some time to process, maybe you pay it back the next year. Maybe you pay it back over a couple of years. There are different methods that can be used, but these are the kinds of things specifically that are regionally analyzed and diagnosed and prescribed. It's really important to count discards and bycatch and try to reduce it to the extent possible. I'll just repeat what others have said. First, this is killing fish. It doesn't matter whether they were meant to be caught or not. Secondly, your bycatch may be my target, and if you kill a baby of the species that I want, I may not have it in the future. Third, it may be a perfectly good waste. It may be a perfect waste of perfectly good food. So it's just wrong to shovel it off the side of the boat into the ocean. And then finally, if you are really trying to manage your fish sustainably, you have to know you have to count everything. You really have to know what's going on. Now, Daniel talked a little bit about who gets the fish. ITQs, catch shares, all of these expressions. Once you say, all right, we're going to allow 100% of whatever the species is to be caught, 10,000 tons of this species is going to be caught, Then the question is, who gets it? Who gets that fish? Do you sell it to the highest bidder? Do you give it away to people who have been catching it for years? Do you set up some kind of a system that Daniel was referring to as ITQs, that are these quotas? They have the word Q, quota, letter Q, quotas in it, so that it can be traded and end up in banks? Do you set aside, as happens in the United States, you may set aside for different sectors? You allocate, you have a question of allocation. So the gillnet sector gets a certain amount, the trawl sector gets a certain amount, the longline sector gets a certain amount, the recreational fishermen get a certain amount. These are questions that come when you have abundance. They're really hard when you have no fish and lead to a lot of conflict, but they're still very hard when you have lots of fish. So thinking carefully about who gets the fish, setting aside quotas for artisanal fishers is a common and obvious solution, but think hard about it. It's not just about the fish. Enforcement is essential. I won't go on about that. People have talked about it. But data is really essential. And I don't mean complicated data. You've heard people talk also about data poor situations. You do kind of have to know what the catch is. You really need catch monitoring. You have to have reasonable estimates of catch and reasonable estimates of discards. This is, if I had one bit of universal advice from all around the world, data poor is different from data free. It's really difficult to manage with no data at all. And catches and knowing who's fishing are pretty much kind of the minimum, and you need those. So my advice is do it. Start now. I guarantee you won't be able to solve all of the problems all at once. They're all big and all complicated, and you'll probably get things wrong when you start. But I guarantee that if you don't start, you will never succeed. So, thank you.